Okay, it's 5 o'clock, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. This panel is the magic of style guides for writers and editors, so like a writing craft workshop. I'm going to just go ahead and read the long description of the panel so we all know what it's about, and then we'll go into some introductions and then talk about it and get into it. Time for questions at the end. So the long description of this panel. In the creation process, can you all hear me okay? Everything good? Okay, great. In the creative process, breaking the rules is part of the fun, but knowing when to follow them and when to make your own can help your book or script feel cohesive and make the writing process easier. A style guide or story bible is a way to document important decisions, whether it's the spelling of a superhero name in a comic book, the fictional astronomy of a fantasy novel, or the punctuation of an invented language in a TV series. In this panel, a writer, myself, and an editor who worked in both original fiction and established IPs will discuss some of these tools that big companies and small creators alike can use in their writing. I'm going to introduce you, and then you can introduce me back, and then we'll just do it that way. Madeleine is an editor, proofreader, and consultant whose clients range from micropresses and self-publishers to Penguin Random House, DC Comics, and Vox Media. She has created style guides for authors, publishers, and other organizations and worked on countless licensed IP projects across both fiction and nonfiction. She is also the author of The Proofreader's Guide, got it over in the corner, to comic book style, an editorial handbook for the print and digital comics, and she's also the co-head and senior editor at Twin Cities Geek, which is a local online magazine.
And can everyone hear me okay?
Great. Please use the microphone.
Yeah, it's right here. Is that better?
No. Get in there.
How's this?
It's a little better.
Much better.
Okay, thanks. Joe, writing as J.M. Lee, is a Minneapolis writer best known for his work within the world of Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal, for which he has written novels, television, comics, and numerous official lore books. He also teaches and writes on craft and supports the wider writing community as a focused editor for queer and Chinese American diaspora themes. His most recent novel, The Nightland Express, is a historical YA fantasy focusing on intersectional American identity and the iconic Pony Express.
Thank you. So that's who we are. I think probably the most pertinent place to start with this panel is to really actually just set down a definition for what a style guide is. So we're going to talk about why style guides are great, what they are, what they aren't. I think starting kind of where that all begins in the definition is a great place to begin. Why don't can you give me your definition? So I think coming from an editor, this is more of an editorial document, so we're going to start from the editor perspective and talk about what that means to you.
Yeah. So the term style guide can apply to a few different tools within the writing and publishing world, and so you might hear it applied to different things. But what we're going to be talking about today is essentially a document that is a place to document decisions for a book, a series, a world, an intellectual property, and that's decisions related to grammar, style, world building, and the big all the way down to the very little. So, for example, you can include something as picky as an example I like to give is Spider-Man. When Spider-Man's name appears in a comic book, it's Spider-Man. The hyphen is important. We put that in the style guide. Or if you are a prose author, are you using the serial comma? People have really strong feelings about the serial comma. That's the kind of thing that would go in a style guide as well.
How many of you in here are writers? Okay, cool. Anybody in here an editor or proofreader, copy? Cool. Awesome. Very cool. So I think those are really great examples for technical stuff. Other things that I have seen in style guides as someone who works on IP, like intellectual property projects, which is basically where I come into projects that have multiple authors, multiple creators, all working on the same property, on the same within the same canon in some ways. And some of the stuff I would see in a style guide when I receive a new project, there's two kind of easy to, communicate examples. So I've worked on the Boxcar Children before, and as many of you know, the Boxcar Children have a specific origin story that's part of their canon, how they became the Boxcar Children. And in the style guide for the Boxcar Children series, is actually basically like a bullet point that says make sure that you tell everybody what the origin story is within the first chapter. So that's not something that as like kind of like specific as a punctuation choice, but this is something that the editors and the publishers want to see in every single Boxcar Children book. So, and actually, if you go down and look at a Boxcar Children book, you will see that because that's something that editors are like checking to make sure that that's in there. And another example of like a vocabulary style guide choice is one that's in the Dark Crystal style guide, which is that, so Gelfling are like this fantasy, are we familiar with the Dark Crystal? Probably, yeah, okay. I never know, sometimes yes, sometimes no, depending. So in the Dark Crystal style guide, we have a rule that we don't refer to Gelfling as people. That's just like a very specific vocabulary rule, and it's just something that we keep note of as writers, and then sometimes you'll be writing something and kind of like intuitively accidentally write it, and the editors have that style guide as well, so they know to mark that and say, replace this word with something else.
All this is to say that a style guide can cover a whole range sort of scales from the big picture to the very, very picky. There isn't one universal style for a style guide. There isn't one universal format. They all look different depending on who's created it, who it's for, and kind of the scope of the project.
And also to mention too, like, you might be familiar with other like documents that sound similar to style guides. So there's other things like style sheets, style guides. There's like lore Bibles or like world building Bibles, that kind of thing. These are all kind of documents that are similar in a lot of ways. Yeah, and we'll go into that a little bit later when we talk about what those other documents are and how they might be different or not overlap with style guides. I think the next thing that we were thinking to sort of illustrate the way that a style guide is created and works, especially between the interaction between an editor and an author, is that actually we worked on my book together, The Nightland Express. Madeleine actually edited this, I wrote it, and in doing so, when I first received her first like editorial letter about the book, it included her comments on it as well as the style style guide that she had written for this book. And that was sort of the first time that I had ever received something like that as an author that was for like my own original work. Because I've been working with them for existing IP, so it was really interesting to see sort of what Madeleine had like, as she was reading and editing the book, how she had sort of decided what went into this document. And so I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that process, sort of like the birth of this document and sort of where it comes from.
Yeah, so essentially every project that I work on as an editor, whether that's a book, a comic, a series, an article, I'm either following a style guide or I'm creating a style guide, or in some cases both. So in the case of an original novel like this, I was following an overall style guide for the publisher, but I was also creating a style guide specific to the world of this book. And essentially the process of that is, as I was editing, distilling all of the clear decisions that I could see that Joe had made in the book in terms of stylistic decisions about, this character speaks with contractions, this character doesn't, they always speak much more formally.
Which, by the way, those are intuitive decisions that I made, so I was just like writing a book and she was like, oh, this is consistently this way, and
yes.
Now we're gonna make it consistent in case you ever weren't consistent somewhere else when you were just writing your novel.
Yes, and I find that is a huge part of what creating a style guide is essentially taking the big picture, like seeing from the outside what the author has done intuitively and documenting those decisions so that, like Joe said, if there's any place that the author wasn't consistent and they want to make sure that it's consistent, or something just isn't jiving for me, then I can go back to this document and say, is this how you wanted to do it everywhere? And maybe they didn't. Fiction especially, obviously you break the rules a lot. Not everybody speaks the same way all the time. Any good editor knows when to apply a quote-unquote rule and when to leave something alone. But documenting what are intentional decisions and what maybe someone had done without thinking about it, and now that they kind of look at the big picture, they want to do it a different way. Documenting that in the style guide allows the editor and then also other people down the line working on a book like a proofreader to make sure that the book is following the style that the author wants, or in some cases the publisher wants, rather than maybe making ill-advised corrections that are maybe well-intentioned but not what the author meant to do.
I have 3 examples from this book specifically that I think might help sort of illustrate this process. One of them, and this one specifically was sort of enlightening for me, which is that one of Madeleine's questions was, so there's a character in the book named Ben, and her question was basically well, let me go back. In the style guide, she has a section where it just has the main character's basic information. So it's their age, their eye color, anything that I refer to or should be consistent throughout the course of the book. And so one of the questions was, what color are Ben's eyes? Because you use green and hazel throughout the book. And I'm colorblind, so I didn't realize those were different colors. So it wasn't I was being inconsistent, it was just that I was just green or hazel, it's the same, whatever. And so we had this comment, and then we had some back and forth of questioning that, and I was just oh, so there's a thing you know about me. So then we went back to the style guide, made that comment, and then Madeleine was able to go back into the manuscript and using the style guide markup anytime I had used, I think we went with green, or did we go with hazel? I don't remember, so this is to me. Whichever one you went with, yeah. Another thing that I found very useful for me as an author, so in this book there's a gender fluid character, and I actually go back and forth between using she, her, and he pronouns for this character at a certain point of the book. And so there was sort of, and it's a theme of the book that gender is sort of a metaphor for magic in a lot of ways. And so first we had the question of when do we use which pronouns for this character, and are we being consistent, and sort of Madeleine asking questions did you mean for this section to be inconsistent within the paragraph? Was that intentional, or do you want to keep the pronouns the same in one paragraph and then they can change them? What are the mechanics of when we change back and forth? And then there were also some characters that she had a query, because I was using gendered pronouns for them, and then she had a query that I found developmentally very interesting for the manuscript, which was do these characters use human gendered pronouns, or do we want to do that? And I was oh, that's interesting. So then actually we went back and I went to, there's 4 or 5 characters in this book that I don't use any pronouns. And so we worked really, it was hard. It was very difficult to use no pronouns for a handful of characters. But I went back through there, I did my best, and then I think you took another look at it to make sure that I hadn't missed any that had been in there from the first draft. And then there are also things in this guide like anachronisms. It's a historical novel, so we wanted to make a rule about when do we use anachronisms, when is it okay to use anachronisms, or when should we really make sure that the lexicon is time appropriate, which was, sometimes we're just I don't know. Does it sound good? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's a great example too, because something a YA historical fantasy, you have a decision to make of, do you want this to be really, really precisely accurate, or is there some artistic license happening? And again, documenting that decision so that your editor knows, are we really being picky about this, or am I just flagging something if it really seems out of step with the time period?
Which I think actually might be a good way to segue into this next point, which is, and I'll ask this to you as an editor, because I think generally, so I do use style guides when I'm authoring, but I would say that the style guide document is typically going to be used most heavily by the editorial team in checking for this consistency. So I would ask to you as an editor, why would you say that a style guide is useful? We kind of already answered this question. The short version is consistency. But how do you see this used in your workflow? How do you see this used in workflow of other editorial processes?
Yeah, so from my end as an editor, the biggest usefulness of a style guide is again, making sure things are consistent throughout, making sure the author's wishes are followed, making sure the publisher's wishes are followed. In some cases, with those licensed IPs, they have very specific rules of, we are allowing you to use our characters in our world, but you have to follow all of these rules. And the better that you can follow it before you send it to that licensor for review, the smoother the rest of the process is going to be. And from more of an author standpoint, I always encourage authors to really review and embrace a style guide, because it's their opportunity to make sure that their intent is being carried out. Whether you're self-publishing or you're publishing with a company, it is a tool where the author can communicate to me the things that they want to be doing with language, the things they want to be doing with character. Is it really important that a particular term is capitalized or spelled a certain way? Is it really important that a particular character talk a certain way? A lot of those I can glean as I'm editing something, but I'm not necessarily going to pick up on every single thing the author is doing. And so really it can be sort of a communication document that I communicate to the author, this is what I'm seeing, is this correct, does this look good to you? And the author can communicate back to me and say yes or no.
In your work, especially editing with an IP, how frequently would you say you receive a style guide for a project that you're working on, compared to especially when you take a project from an author directly? What does that look like? So if I'm getting a project from a publisher or an IP holder, pretty much always I'm getting either a style guide or at least some sort of direction on follow the Chicago Manual of Style and Merriam-Webster Dictionary. If I'm working directly with an author, it's pretty rare that I would get a style guide that they've already put together, just because typically, as Joe said, they are sort of an editor document, so usually I'm the one creating them for the author rather than the other way around. But I will occasionally, some authors are super well prepared and they have a full style guide prepared, but more often it's, I would say, just a set of notes about these are the things that I'm doing and they're part of my author voice and I want to make sure that they don't get changed in the editing process. And then those notes essentially become the start of my style guide. This is a question that's not in our notes, so I apologize. How would you describe the difference between a style guide for a fiction project compared to a nonfiction project? That's a great question. Fiction is generally going to have a lot more notes. Well, it's inherently going to have a lot more notes typically about dialogue use. I already mentioned, sort of formality of speech or anachronisms, that sort of thing. Also, for a fiction style guide, I'm going to be listing out characters and generally, again, as Joe mentioned earlier, sort of some basic stats to kind of make sure that those stay consistent. Whereas in nonfiction, I'm going to be listing out, important people, but there's going to be, a whole list of here are all of the proper nouns that were used in here. So I'd say those are the biggest ones, and also I would say most often in nonfiction, rules are being applied a little bit more stringently. Not always. I've edited for, BuzzFeed. It's, you get plenty of casual language in there, but then you're also following a style guide under there, so sort of, but on the whole, you're going to be breaking the rules a little bit more generally in fiction than in nonfiction, and so a fiction style guide might include some notes about, what rules are okay to ignore. This is how the Chicago Manual of Style does it, but it's fun. Comma splices are a big one, which is sort of where you're connecting two full sentences with a comma in between. The proper way to do that is with either a period or an em dash in between, but it's also very common in casual writing, and so making a note of that, comma splices are fine, ignore them. That's really useful for me. Cool, thank you. And another question as an editor, since you did mention that many of the fiction or manuscripts that you receive from authors do not come with style guides, now that we have told a room full of authors about style guides, do you want to see style guides from authors? And if so, in what format or what capacity would you like to see that? Because, with a caveat, I'm working on another novel, And I actually started working on a style guide for it, and we actually were kind of discussing it, because I was like, I don't even know if this is a style guide. Like, there's some stylistic stuff in here, there's some things about like hyphenation, capitalization, there's some like calendar stuff. But there's also like my personal notes about like how the world works and like the geography and the historiography and that kind of stuff. So like when you sort of like open the door to authors and say like style guides are really useful, do you see that is there like a subset of that? Okay, authors have lots of information that we don't put into the novels, we just have like buckets and buckets and buckets of it. Where would you say as an editor is like a useful boundary to shape what you would actually use and what might just be more information for the author during their writing process?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would never expect to receive a style guide from an author, so it's absolutely, it's not a standard thing. Don't feel like if you're working with an editor or publisher that you're expected to do this. But it's always great when it does happen. I would say the main determining factor of what information you send an editor should be what is going to be useful for them in the specific work that they're doing. And that does depend, are you working with a developmental editor who's really working on the big picture kind of character plot stuff? Are you working with a copy editor who's doing all of the nitty-gritty spelling grammar stuff? That's going to drive what's useful. But sort of as a general rule, I would say anything involving, spelling, punctuation, fictional or real proper nouns, anything like that is super useful. Character names especially since those can change. If you've renamed a character, like in a late draft of your manuscript, that's helpful to know. So if you have, like Anna used to be named Chelsea, then I know if I randomly come across a Chelsea that's wrong and I can get rid of it.
This is just a note about the one that I'm working on. So I actually have a character in this manuscript that I was working on a style guide for that actually changed the gender of likely in a draft. And so it can be easier to like find and replace a name, like a proper name. It's impossible to just find and replace pronouns like somewhere in a manuscript. So like if you're like, no, this is what I meant, but it was this before. That's like a really useful like tracking history documentation.
Yeah, I would also say that to a certain degree, stuff like if you've created like a timeline for your book, especially if you have like multiple timelines or like any weebly wobbly time travel stuff happening, that can be really useful for the editor as well, especially for a copy editor, but to an extent for a developmental editor as well. Generally when I'm working through, I'm going to at least be taking notes on the overall timeline just to make sure that there aren't any inconsistencies, or if I find something confusing on the page, I can refer to my notes and be like, oh no, they covered this. Typically an editor wouldn't need like super detailed, backstory or world building stuff, but to the extent that it is potentially going to affect an edit, like maybe if you have a fantasy novel, some basic information about like the mechanics of how a magic system works, even if the details of that are not explained in the story, that can be useful for kind of reference information, so that again, if an editor reaches a point of confusion, they can understand, oh, is this just something that the author has created but hasn't fully explained, and maybe I should prompt them to explain it a little more, or conversely, is this an inconsistency that we need to talk about?
I think when we were discussing this panel and kind of figuring out like how we were defining a style guide, like what goes in a style guide, one of the things that came up in that conversation was that like a style guide is useful to promote and encourage and maintain consistency among like the actual words on the page, right? So it's like an editor is looking at what the words on the page are, they're editing those words, and obviously words have meaning, but as far as like what this document in particular, how it is used is to make sure that we are being consistent with the words that are like physically, it's printed right on the page.
Yeah. Or if it's inconsistent, it's deliberately inconsistent.
Right.
Basically, like the motto of copy editors is whatever you do it consistently, even if that's inconsistency.
Yes. Before we go to the next section, could you outline maybe the most common sections that you would see in a style guide and what's in them, and then like maybe some of the less common ones that are still useful depending on the project.
Yeah. So most style guides that I create will have the style references. So typically a style guide is something that accompanies other editorial references. So I mentioned earlier the Chicago Manual of Style, the AP Style book is another one, and what dictionary you're following, because correct spelling is not always universal. You know, different dictionaries will like hyphenate things differently. Maybe something's one word, two words. There are actually differences, and the differences usually aren't super important, but having a consistent reference to just say, I don't have to make a decision every time on how to punctuate or space this term. I just refer to the dictionary. So outside style references. That also includes if there are any other references you're following. To use a nonfiction example, there might be like a dictionary of naval terminology. Then you'll have some style notes on any punctuation. So if there are any rules for punctuation in the work that go above and beyond the style references. Any particular preferences of like I do or don't like using commas here. Any formatting things that again go against those references. So like are we italicizing the names of spells or are we just capitalizing them? And then spelling is going to be usually a big chunk. So you're going to have your character section if it's fiction, with again some just basic information, and then I'm going to list any proper noun, any common noun that is either basically anything that isn't in the dictionary or that we're going to be spelling differently than it appears in the dictionary. Any conlangs, any invented languages. And then any important sort of mechanics or timeline notes.
Great.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So my document that I'm making for my own reference, this manuscript that I'm working on, which is a beast, has a lot of stuff in it, but is not included in sort of the style guide stuff. So my document that I have is like got lore stuff. I think I mentioned has historiography stuff. It has some it has a cast of characters, including side characters and like their ages and just general stuff like that, which may be useful, but also it's more for my benefit as an author. So I think that it would be maybe useful to go into the other types of reference documents that occur in writing and editing and talk about whether or not they are similar to style guides, whether or not there's overlap, whether or not they are not. So I have a couple notes here. So I could just interview you. So how would you differentiate between a style manual and a style guide? Are we all familiar with what a style manual? Let me define the style manual after the examples.
Yeah, so I've mentioned the Chicago Manual already. Essentially, if you've never seen the Chicago Manual of Style, it's a big, 1,000-page plus book that lays out rules for almost every conceivable situation an editor could find themselves in. How do I hyphenate this? When do I use a comma? Do I capitalize job titles? Do I...
A lot of us use this a lot to figure out how to do a citation properly. So there's lots of ways to use citations differently, right? So you would pick which manual you're using and then use that style.
Yeah, I would say non-editors mainly interact with style manuals when they're doing citations. And I definitely use the citation section when I'm working on nonfiction, but there is a whole world out there. It covers grammar, it covers formatting, word usage. Inclusive language, all that kind of stuff. So that is just a whole big brick of rules. A style guide essentially is a companion document that says what does the style manual not cover, what does the style manual say, but we don't like that, we want to do it differently, and what is specific to this individual publisher or series or whatever that is obviously bespoke and only applies So the confusing thing is that people will sometimes use the term style guide to refer to a style guide, a style manual, or a style sheet. They're all in the same ecosystem, and there is definitely overlap.
I was gonna talk about style sheets next
but
if you want to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so a style sheet is sort of a more specific distillation of a style guide, where a style guide is generally meant to cover an entire, like a whole publisher or a whole series, a whole world. So this style guide would apply to any other books written in the Nightwind universe. Whereas a style sheet is going to be for a specific project. So it's essentially covers many of the same things as a style guide, but it's just project-based. It's really narrow.
Programmatically, I kind of envision it as it's tiered, right? So
Yeah.
like you have basically your default rules or your style manual. Exceptions to that at the next level would be like a style guide for a series or a property. And then on top of that, we have a final layer of just like exceptions or changes for the style sheet for this single project. I think that kind of stacks it nicely.
Yeah.
And often on projects, you may be working with all three.
Yeah.
Or not often, but sometimes. Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I would say more often than not, I'm working with all three. It would be very typical. So I do some work for individual authors, but I do the majority of my work for publishers. And so if a publisher sends me a project, they're going to generally be sending me their in-house style guide. And that is going to tell me which style manual to reference, and then I'm going to create a style sheet for the individual title, which sounds like a lot. But it all sort of works in harmony.
Yeah. So speaking of a lot, the next thing that we have on our list are character and story Bibles. So these are going to be documents that I think a lot of writers are more familiar with, because these are documents that we create that include like basically all of our just like brain stuff that's going on during the creation of a manuscript that we then like don't necessarily put into the manual or into the book. So a character or story Bible, character Bible is going to be basically like, it's going to have a really in-depth, like your origin story, your backstory, maybe it will have some lineage stuff, like some of the stuff that you'll see in appendices of like really long-running high fantasy novels, for example. You'll see that kind of stuff in there. A lot of times for a world Bible or a story Bible, you'll have just stuff that is only maybe referenced in your manuscript, like things like the way that the solar system works, or like how long the days are. Like I've got stuff in mind to think about, like how many days are in a month and how that adds up, and is it parallel to our Earth or not?
Yeah.
Just that really in-depth stuff that I actually find it's super useful for when you're writing a novel. It's not necessarily as useful for an editor when they're like working on the final manuscript.
Yeah, although you might reference it if you get a question from your editor. I would love to know, because you've worked on both, you've created, sort of story Bibles or lore Bibles, like personally for your own projects. You've also worked on lore Bible, like internal use only lore Bibles for IP, and then you've also published like the Gelfling, you've written Gelfling lore books that are published for the public. And so I would love to know kind of what are kind of the overlaps or the differences among those.
Yeah, so this is most pertinent with the Dark Crystal, which is obviously like a super old beloved property. The original film is from 1982, so like this goes way back. And since then, there have been multiple basically attempts at different treatments. There's been graphic novels, there's been comics, there was a novel by A.C.H. Smith that predates my novels by like decades. Then of course I came on to write the 4 YA novels, and then in addition to that, and I also worked on the Netflix show, which we then were leveraging information that had been written in the novels. So there it was like one person at Henson, Jim Formanek, rest in peace, and his job was to be the lore keeper at Henson for the Dark Crystal and other properties. So I was working with Jim frequently to decide like, what are the 7 clans? Like, where do they live? Like, stuff like that. Like, basically information that we need to know in order to sort of like work through this story, make sure that the whole world is consistent in the canon. And that conversation, there was the website, which was, I think, basically so the Dark Crystal or I think it's just darkcrystal.com. It's up now, and you can look at basically what the Dark Crystal lore book is. It's online. You can just look at it. And as we were sort of working through all this information that we took from these different iterations and treatments that may or may not have been greenlit, we basically pulled all of that into the website, which became the kind of the Bible. And then there was also a lot of secret stuff that we were working on for the show that we knew about but didn't get published because we weren't sure if it was going to get into the show or not. But some of that actually is referenced in some of the. So I basically wrote the Dark Crystals. I don't even know how to describe it. It's sort of like what's the series that shall not be named. There's a companion lore book about creatures and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That book. I wrote that book, but for the Dark Crystal. And it's a 30,000 word long song book of these tales and songs and mythology and folklore for the Gelfling. And so taking the lore from the Bible and then kind of extrapolating it into this fictional framework and voice is how that book got written. But also I wrote the children's tie-in character book, who is Rianne, who is Deet, and then it's got the pictures and the puppets and stuff like that. So that's basically lifted right off of the website. So there's different ways to work with the World Bibles, but it suffice to say, all way more information that you would ever really need to have in a style guide, because it's more about your interpretation of world consistency in the world, the magic system, and that kind of thing, rather than do we italicize the Gelfling clan names or that kind of stuff. The other thing we kind of discussed, which is sort of what I'm talking about now, is a wiki. So you'll see all kinds of fan wikis, official wikis. Those are the digital version in many cases, a fan's interpretation usually of the world-building Bible in a searchable kind of a sense. But again, so much information, super useful though.
Yeah, let me say, God bless the fan wikis. I work for a lot of big publishers and really well-known IPs, and I'm not going to name any names, but many of them reference the wikis. So the people on the inside definitely know they're there and they appreciate the work. Bless.
Yep, because it is often not possible to find people internally that have the time to create those. It really does a lot of times rely on people who love stuff so much that they have committed this. They know it. They don't have to go research it, or they enjoy researching it. So, yeah, definitely the wikis are amazing. I have also here formatting and proofreading guidelines. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what that might look like and whether it is or is not a style guide?
Sure, yeah. I would say that sometimes publishers will include that kind of information, kind of append it to the style guide. Sometimes, very often, it's going to be a separate document. But as an editor or proofreader, every publisher does things a little bit differently, just in terms of workflow, in terms of just basically how they want me to work. And so some of that, is going to have a little bit of overlap with style stuff, but it's going to be the really boring, technical stuff of, here's how we want you to leave your track changes comments, and here's how we want you to differentiate, questions for the author versus questions for the in-house editor. And that is something that's going to typically go along with the style guide, but it's not going to be part of it.
I have never seen one of those documents. They just assume, you know how to use track changes, right?
Well, you probably get author guidelines for the formatting of your manuscript, right? Really?
No.
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 I mean, also,
Well, okay, no, actually, this is kind of a funny story. It was a story, it's an anecdote. So I've been writing, I started writing, publishing in, I don't know, the 2000s, I think. And back then, the idea was your manuscript, when you submit it, should be in Courier, double-spaced, 1-inch margins. It was very, very specific. And I recently received a manuscript arc that was it was basically for review, but it was a manuscript that had been accepted by a publisher. And I opened it up and there was a pretty border around the title page, and like they had used some fancy fonts, and then like the agency had like their logo graphic in there, and I was just like, what? I can make it pretty? Like I was allowed to do that this whole time. I told my agent, like, stop, don't send it out anymore. I'm gonna make it pretty. So we made it pretty, and she's sending it out now. So fingers crossed. That's very funny. Okay, so that maybe is a good segue for our last bit. What is a style guide not for? Like, what documents are definitely not style guides? Maybe this is actually similar to what I was just talking about, which is that a document that you may receive, I don't know if maybe you would receive this. I feel like it's possible that I would receive this as an editor, as like a critique editor or like a beta reader, which is like a like sometimes when I've received additional documents with a manuscript, and it might have been sort of like defined or called a style guide or just like a additional document for that. Often what that document is actually the pitch document. So that document often, like, I'll open it up just to see what it is, and it usually has like the summary and the synopsis and the pitch and information about marketing, for example. So like that, I don't think that's an overlap necessarily, but it might intuitively feel like an overlap to be like, this book has this, and this in it. It appeals to these audiences. So like some more statistical information about the project as a whole is not style guide information. That really goes more with your marketing material, your marketing document, or your pitch document that you work with your agent or whoever is marketing your book.
Yeah, style guide really lives like in the editorial realm. So like as an author, like all of that information is going to be relevant to you. But what goes into a document that you send someone else or that someone else might send you is going to be driven by their role in the process. So like working with an editor or a publisher, like the style guide is going to be sort of your common document, whereas if you're working with an agent, it's going to be a pitch document, or for nonfiction, a book proposal, that sort of thing. Like an agent generally isn't going to need to see a style guide unless they're doing some editing work with you.
For sure. This is just a sentence I don't know. And we wrote, will not help you get published.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Good for an already collaborative environment. So style guides, like you just said, like they come out of the editorial process. I don't think that like if you have like a manuscript and you have your style guide and you send it out to a publisher, they're not gonna be like, wow, this is a great document that makes us want to publish your book more. They might want to publish your book for other reasons, but the style guide, when you send it out, like it's not part of the sending out process.
Yeah, it's going to be when you're already like signed with a publisher generally, or you're already working with a freelance editor, for example. So like it's going to be appreciated, but it's not something that is going to kind of add to your whole package.
Do you want to talk about this one? Because I think you added that. Do you receive those?
Yeah, I guess
I would never.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing to say would be, as I say, like a style guide is a place where an author and an editor and a publisher communicate. But hopefully it's not a place to lay down like edicts, like declarations in either direction. If you're an editor, even if you have to follow like a publisher's rules, you don't want to like stomp all over an author's, voice and style, obviously, even if there has to be some negotiation there. But conversely, as an author, it is from the editor's perspective, an author who wants to talk to me about their goals, what they have done, what they what's important to them to preserve in their manuscript versus what they are looking for advice and guidance on is always a really great relationship, as opposed to like an author who comes to me and is basically like, here's this document, I want you to follow this, do X, Y, Z. The reason that I'm not worried about ChatGPT stealing my job is that I am not just a robot that is applying rules. There's always going to be some degree of, personal judgment. And for anything important, of course, I'm going to ask the author, which of these paths are we using? But, I think it really sets the tone for like a collaborative relationship, like that that communication approach to a style guide as opposed to one person saying, yes, this is how it's going to be, regardless of who that person in the process is.
For sure. More of like, yeah, more like a wall.
Yeah.
Here's my document, or else.
Yeah.
So the title of this, let me just go back to this, the magic of style guides for writers and editors. How would you say style guides are magical? What about it is so great? How does it make things better for you?
Well, I mean, I think, to go back to a little bit of what we were talking about at the beginning of the panel, I really love the idea that the process of creating a style guide can sort of elucidate things that an author has done with a work, whether or not they're conscious of it. I think there's something really interesting to being able to tease out these things, these connections or these preferences that really come naturally. That's sort of the magic of writing to me. To
It's kind of like
being able
capturing
to-
it, like putting a fairy in a bottle. Like, I got
yeah,
it.
yeah, it feels a little bit like that sometimes, and it's especially rewarding, in a case like working on Madeleine, where I sort of sent this to you, and you're like, oh, like you identified things here that like I didn't realize I was doing, and like yes, this is good, or like no, I want to do this differently, and feeling like I was able to help, feeling like I'm able to help an author kind of distill and shape the book or the script so that it really is what they want it to be, because that's really what my role is to just, polish this in whatever way is going to serve the work and serve the author. Being able to do that it's this really interesting combination of this kind of nebulous, creative juices stuff and like the really nitty gritty, like picky, like why are you asking me about this like really specific comma thing? That there's sort of a reason for the pickiness.
For sure. I actually, when I was thinking about this too, like, I would say that personally, just as a person, seeing a style guide that accurately reflects not just what I did, but what I wanted to do was very validating as a writer and as a person. To be like, oh, you read what I wrote and you understood what I was doing and you're on my side, we're collaborating, and now we're gonna make this like apply across this whole thing consistently. And also, similarly, working in like an IP project where there's a lot of different people working on something and receiving a style guide, for me the magic is like it kind of makes the world feel more solid and real because we have some parameters, we have some rules that we're all playing within the same place, and it allows multiple concurrent parallel projects to occur at the same time and still be playing by the same rules, even if maybe they don't like overlap completely.
Yeah.
The cohesiveness among multiple creators creating something at the same time is just like really, I don't know, gratifying as a creator.
Yeah.
So that's the magical content that we have for you. I would be happy to, we have about 12 minutes left to open to Q&A. Yes, and so the colored signs that we have here are for raising so that we can call on you without being weird about it. So yes, yellow X.
So I actually have two questions. They're not connected to each other at all. The first one is, how does assumed audience influence the creation of a style guide, if at all? And the second one is, do you know of any online resources very specifically for like this type of style guide being created for a specific work of fiction, the way that you said that you were doing together when you were working, like specifically, so like finding the rules of style within what a writer has already done?
Yes.
Maybe start backwards because you should just write that book. That's what you should do.
Yeah, there are a couple of resources online. Catherine O'Moore Klopf is an editor, KOK Edit. She has a lot of resources about a huge range of editorial topics. She has a section on her site called the Copy Editor's Knowledge Base, and it's just like a repository of information. I believe she has like some style guide references there. Erin Brenner at Right Touch Editing has some information on style guides, and I believe Jane Friedman may have some as well, but don't quote me on that one. And I'm sorry, what was your first question again?
The first question was, how does assumed audience fit into
yeah.
crafting style guide?
Yeah, that's definitely a factor because I, especially in my nonfiction work, I do a lot of editing that is written by a subject matter expert, but for a general audience. So teasing out like what types of like technical jargon is okay to use versus what we need to define versus when we want to avoid the jargon altogether and just use plain language. That is definitely something that would come out of like a conversation, among all of the people who are involved in the project, because being able to tailor the right kind of level of information and the right tone is going to be huge for making sure that you're reaching the audience that you want to.
I would second that too. So like in the Boxcar Children's Style Guide, there is definitely information about like sentence structure, vocabulary. So there's like technical stuff about like how long the sentences should be. But there's also things, for example, like whenever there is a dialogue, there has to be like a speaker tag. So it has to say every single piece of that. So sometimes with adult fiction, you'll just see dialogue and you'll assume who's speaking. So for Boxcar Children, which is for younger readers, one of the rules is always make sure you say who said what was said. Just things like that to make the reading process a little bit more fluid for that age group.
Yeah, that's also going to feed into like leveling, like for young readers, like there are specific like ways to score books and specific tools that will help.
And I think
calibrate.
that drives a lot of those style guides.
Hashtag.
To what degree is a style guide standardized in how it collates the information, like how you organize places, people, themes, etc.? Is it generally more determined by like what group hired the editor, or is it more bespoke to each project?
I would say it for a style guide that is provided to an editor, it's typically driven by that publisher, just sort of how they prefer to organize information and how thorough or not they prefer to be. Are they restating rules that you can also find in the Chicago Manual of Style, or are you only writing stuff that can't be found there? When a freelance editor is creating a style guide for a publisher or author, it's going to be driven more by that individual editor. I have sort of a standard format that I start with, but what sections I include is going to depend on the project. So if there aren't a lot of proper nouns in a particular book, then I might just have them all in one list. But if I have a lot, then I'm going to divide it up, organize it so that it's easier to use into like place names, people names, that sort of thing. So both sides.
Hashtag over here.
So this is kind of a weird one. So when you have because you talk about like creativity discussions and those sort of things, have you ever dealt with a situation where somebody's like going with something that's objectively the wrong choice for something? And I don't mean this in my opinion. I mean in a character who's described as a paraplegic in one scene is in the next scene described as being a runner. Like that level, or even like things where you can tell, like a bad example. I once had a friend who had an assassin aiming something to intimidate the main character, and it was, and I quote, big as yo head. I was very examined, and she changed it. But I kind of just went thinking, like, what if she was insistent that this like mean evil assassin in this R-rated book would be eating a giant ice cream sandwich?
So I think there's two things that we're talking about here. There's like logical inconsistencies, right? And that kind of thing is an editor's job, not editor's job, but like you definitely could comment on that and be like, okay, so this is maybe like the Nightland Express, but this book takes place along the iconic Pony Express, which goes from St. Joe's to Sacramento, and the moon plays a really big role. And we talked a lot about the moon. So I wanted the moon to be full because it's like magical, but then Madeleine was like, because it also takes place in a real time and date, and over a set period of time, and she was like, was the moon even visible from that location at that time? And then she was like online and like some moon website.
Okay, well my first question was, do you want this to actually like follow like the real historical astronomical, like, because you tell me, like, you just tell me if you're like, it's magic, hand wavy, I don't care, great, I'll just like make sure that it follows a logical progression of like the phases. But like if you want to know like what was the moon phase in this location on this date in history, like
we can find that out.
We can do that.
Yeah. So to your question about like logical inconsistencies, I would say that as a writer, and I think you also as an editor, that like communication with the author, ultimately the author is the author of the work, and the editor's job is to support that. I'm sure that there's like some personal feelings that occur. So there's that. And then we're talking about things where you maybe just have a strong feeling about something, and what happens if you call it out, then the author is like, nah. What do you do?
Yeah, I don't know that I can think of an example where like something is not just like not what I would recommend, but like objectively wrong. Like I don't think I can think of an example that is like that glaring. Like I will occasionally get pushback, on like stylistic things. Like usually when I'm editing an author for a publisher. So maybe there's a style rule that like the publisher is insistent about, and the author's like, I don't like this. Like that's not my decision. Or like occasionally, sort of conscious inclusive language stuff, but like honestly very rarely on that. I find that most of the authors I end up working with, pretty much all the authors I end up working with, are like really grateful to have, unintentionally othering language pointed out to them, and, want to fix that, but, every once in a while there'll be a little bit of bristling.
They probably didn't like get to that stage to like publish works that often, I imagine, either.
You'd be surprised.
Oh,
You'd
no.
be surprised.
The amount of times that I, as a copy editor for a publisher, have, without looking for it, accidentally stumbled on plagiarism is way too high.
Oh, no.
Yeah, like it's like I've Googled a phrase in order to double check that something is spelled correctly, and it turns out it's like word for word that paragraph is from Wikipedia. Professional authors, like, and I always quote the benefit of the doubt and just sort of act as though like you put this in as a placeholder and forgot to go back and replace it, but yeah, you'd be surprised.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm wondering if either of you could speak on like maybe what you'd like to see style guides become, or like what things would be nice to see in the future for style guides. This is sort of a sidebar, but it feels to me in like a lot of ways sort of a moral endeavor. I'm trying to lend clarity or sharpen intentionality, and I don't know. I'm wondering how those two things come together. I guess as a side question. I stuck in a second.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to jump off what I was just saying about inclusive language, that is something that I am seeing more and more publishers include explicitly in their style guides, which I always really appreciate for a number of reasons. Because A, it shows that they care about that sort of thing, and that they've thought about it, and also it kind of lends authority. If I, I'm talking to an author and I'm not just citing like, oh, this is like common best practice, or this is what this like third party widely read reference says. If I'm saying like this is how the publisher does it, that helps, back me up.
Yeah, I would say like boosting the conversation and the conversation ability of these things, because often I think as an editor and as an author, like you'll give, or I will receive a comment, and I'll be like, where is this coming from? Is this like you're like, sometimes I'm thinking that, but I think as an editor too, you're put in a position often where you have to like you don't have to flag things, but you can make the choice to flag something for inclusive language, for example, or conscious language. And then it does become a conversation topic of like, are you gonna get into a thing with the author? Because they're like, no, I always use that word, or like whatever they say about it, And then if you have the style guide, then that is like lending sort of like a context for your comment, and also in a way I would say what I would like to see occur with it is to like kind of set the stage for the conversation between the editor and the author, to say like, we both accept that the style guide is important to us, the things that are in it are important to us, and we can start from there rather than trying to build that with like your first comment in a manuscript or something. Yeah.
Well, and also the thing I find really interesting is there's sort of this catch-22 where editors and publishers are looking to style manuals and dictionaries and other style references to follow, but at the same time, publishers and editors can also be people to help like push language use forward, because the reverse is also true. Like when the lexicographers are doing their update to Merriam-Webster, they're looking what's in like the corpus. They're looking at like what are people using. And so while it's true that like we're following the dictionary, when we are setting exceptions to it or setting exceptions to the Chicago Manual of Style, then those references are in turn looking back to see what authors and publishers and editors are doing and figuring out when there's kind of a preponderance, when it's like showing this is where language is moving and we need to get with it. So like the singular they is a really
For
good
sure,
example.
for sure. Like the style manual or the style guides and like for example Chicago, like that's not something that they're like, nope, this is what it is and this is what it shall always be forever. So like the more conversation there are about these things, potentially there's more online to be read about it, there's more conversations happening about it, and that's how things often can be like evolve and change.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something that I always try to remember to say about both style manuals and style guides. Like, these are not resources that are aiming to set out, like, this is the correct way to do things forever and all time. They are setting out rules to allow you to be consistent within a specific context. So it's not so much...
In a collaborative environment.
Yeah, it's not so much that, like, using or not using the Oxford comma is wrong or right. It's that we just have to make a decision.
And in a way, I think as far as like back to your question too, that we are agreeing that this is the decision that we have made.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas it's not like you're making a rule or I'm setting the boundary as the author or something like that. We're agreeing this is the rule we have agreed upon, and now we'll collaboratively endeavor to. Yes. So we're right up at the hour. Thank you so much for coming to our panel. I think we might be able to hang out for a couple minutes.
Yeah.
And so if you have any questions or whatever, I hope that you have a great time with the rest of the convention.